Here's a question that sounds almost too simple to ask, but the moment you actually pull on it, it opens into something genuinely strange. Did ancient humans, the ones living in caves, hunting mammoths, just trying not to get eaten, did they ever get bored? Like, actually bored, staring at the wall, nothing to do, brain going nowhere bored. Because the instinct most of us have is to say no. Their lives were too hard, too dangerous, too full of immediate survival problems to leave any room for something as soft and modern feeling as boredom. And that instinct turns out to be almost completely wrong. Before we go back 100,000 years, we need to nail down what boredom actually is, because most people have it slightly wrong. Boredom is not the same as laziness. It is not the same as relaxation, or tiredness, or having nothing to do. Boredom is specifically the feeling you get when your brain wants to engage with something meaningful. It is actively searching for stimulation, and it cannot find any. That distinction matters enormously. Boredom is not a passive state. It is an urgent one. Your brain is essentially sending up a flare saying something is missing. Find it. Fix it now. It is uncomfortable by design. And the reason it is uncomfortable by design is a story that starts a very, very long time ago. There is a network of regions in your brain that neuroscientists call the default mode network. It activates specifically when you are not focused on a task. When you zone out, when you daydream, when you stare out a window, that network lights up like a Christmas tree. And here is the thing about it that blew researchers away when they first mapped it. It is not doing nothing. It is working incredibly hard. It is simulating future scenarios, replaying memories, running social predictions, generating creative ideas, constructing your sense of self. The default mode network is essentially your brain's background processor, and boredom is the feeling of that processor spinning up and finding no useful task to grab onto. Which raises a fascinating question. When did humans first have one of those? Now let us go back. Imagine you are a Homo sapiens living roughly 70,000 years ago, somewhere in sub-Saharan Africa. The popular image is constant dramatic action, running from predators, throwing spears, fighting rival groups. And yes, all of that happened. But anthropologists who study modern hunter-gatherer communities, which give us our best window into how ancient humans actually lived, consistently find something surprising about the daily schedule. Adults in hunter-gatherer societies typically spend around 4 to 6 hours a day on actual survival tasks, finding food, preparing it, maintaining tools, tending to the group. That leaves a lot of hours, not empty hours full of nothing, but hours without a single urgent task demanding your attention, hours where your brain is free to wander. Those idle hours were not harmless. For a brain wired by millions of years of evolution to stay alert, to keep scanning for threats, to keep optimizing for survival, sitting still and doing nothing feels wrong at a very deep level. This is actually one of the most fascinating things about the human nervous system. We are not built for sustained idleness. Studies on boredom in modern humans show that people will choose to give themselves mild electric shocks rather than sit alone in a quiet room with their own thoughts for 15 minutes. 15 minutes. And these are people with zero predators, plenty of food, and zero existential threats in the immediate vicinity. Imagine what that restless, searching, must-find something to do feeling felt like sitting in a cave with a finished meal and no task for the next 3 hours. And here is where it gets genuinely profound. Evolutionary psychologists now believe that boredom is not a bug in the human operating system. It is a feature, a deeply important one. The discomfort of boredom is a motivational signal. It pushes you away from inactivity and toward exploration, novelty-seeking, and skill-building. In an ancestral environment, a human who tolerated boredom calmly, who just sat still and waited for the next meal, was a human who was not learning new things, not forming new social bonds, not scouting new territory, not experimenting with new tools. The bored individual who got up and did something, anything, had a survival edge. Boredom, in other words, is one of evolution's ways of making sure you keep moving, keep learning, keep improving. It is restlessness, with a purpose baked right into it. Now here is the part that quietly blew my mind when I first read about it. The oldest known cave paintings, the ones in Lascaux in France, in Altamira in Spain, in the Chauvet Cave. These are not just pretty pictures. They represent something that took enormous time, effort, planning, and creative thought to produce. Pigments had to be sourced and prepared. Scaffolding, yes, actual primitive scaffolding, had to be constructed in some caves to reach the high walls. Torches had to be maintained. Hours, possibly days, of focused creative labor went into these things, and the leading theory about when and why ancient humans made them. In the downtime, when the hunt was done, when the food was secured, when the immediate survival tasks were finished, and that restless, searching brain had nothing urgent to grab onto, and started reaching for something else entirely. It was not just visual art. The oldest musical instruments ever found, bone flutes carved from vulture and bear bones, date back over 40,000 years. And here is what strikes me about that. Carving a musical instrument out of bone is not a survival task. It does not get you food. It does not keep you warm. It does not protect you from predators. It is something you do when the basic needs are met, and your mind starts looking for a problem to solve that does not technically exist yet. Early humans also almost certainly drummed, clapped, and sang long before any instruments were made. Rhythm is so deeply embedded in human neurology that it predates language. The need to make patterns, to make noise, to make something when there was nothing urgent pressing, that is boredom doing its evolutionary job. Anthropologist Polly Wiesner spent years studying the Juhuansi bush people of the Kalahari, one of the world's last fully intact hunter-gatherer communities. She recorded their conversations systematically across different times of day. What she found was striking. During the day, when people were working, conversations were overwhelmingly practical. Who has the food? Where is the game? What needs to be done? But at night, around the fire, when all the practical tasks were done, when, in other words, the group was experiencing communal downtime together, the conversation switched almost entirely to stories. Personal stories, mythological stories, stories about ancestors and spirits and strange events. Wiesner argued that this fireside storytelling was likely the original mechanism through which complex human culture spread. And it happened specifically in the hours that boredom created. Children are interesting here, because they show us the raw, unfiltered version of what boredom actually does to a human brain. If you have ever seen a young child who is genuinely bored, not tired, not hungry, just unstimulated, you know what happens next. They do not sit quietly. They start making things up. They build imaginary worlds out of whatever is around them. They experiment. They take things apart. They start talking to themselves. Developmental psychologists actually argue that boredom in children is a critical developmental state, one where the brain is forced to generate its own stimulation from scratch, which is precisely how creativity and imagination are trained. Ancient children would have experienced this constantly. Long stretches of unstructured idle time and brains that responded by inventing games, narratives, experiments. Boredom was the original school. Now we are getting into genuinely speculative territory, but it is the kind of speculation that serious researchers take seriously. Some anthropologists and cognitive scientists have proposed that the roots of religious and spiritual thinking also lie, at least partly, in the experience of idle contemplation. When your default mode network is running, when you are staring into a fire with nothing to do, and your brain is spinning up simulations and pattern matching everything around you, it starts doing something very specific. It starts seeing agency everywhere, faces in the clouds, intent behind random events, presences in dark spaces. This is a known cognitive bias called hyperactive agency detection, and it likely evolved because it was better to wrongly assume the rustling bush is a predator than to correctly assume it is wind and get eaten. Boredom, and the deep contemplation it produces, may have been the petri dish in which that bias grew into something much larger. There is a pattern in the archaeological record that took researchers a while to notice. Periods of significant tool innovation, the sudden appearance of new and more sophisticated weapon designs, new methods for processing food, new ways of constructing shelters. These periods seem to correlate with evidence of stable, relatively resource-rich environments, not crisis periods. The assumption was always that necessity drove invention. Desperate times forced new solutions, and necessity matters, absolutely. But the archaeological evidence suggests something more nuanced, that the creative cognitive work of invention requires slack time. It requires a brain that is not in pure survival mode, a brain that has the luxury of experimenting, failing, trying again, which only happens when the immediate pressure is off and boredom has nudged you toward doing something, anything, with your hands and mind. One more thing that idle time reliably produces in human groups, and this one is arguably the most important of all, is social bonding. Grooming in primates, which is how our closest relatives spend an enormous amount of their non-survival time, is essentially the equivalent of idle social time. It is not strictly necessary for survival every single moment, but it cements alliances, reduces tension, and maintains the social fabric. For early humans, idle time around the camp became the space for conversation, joke-telling, shared laughter, shared complaint, all the low-stakes social interaction that builds the deep trust that a group needs to function when actual crisis arrives. The anthropologist Robin Dunbar has argued extensively that language itself may have evolved largely as a kind of social grooming, a way to bond with more people simultaneously. If that is true, then boredom is part of the origin story of human language. Now, a fair question here is whether ancient humans felt boredom subjectively the way we do today. And the honest answer is, we cannot know exactly. The felt experience of boredom, that particular self-aware, almost meta-quality of being annoyed at your own lack of engagement, that might require a level of self-reflective consciousness that only emerged gradually. What we can say is that the neurological machinery underlying boredom, the default mode network, the restlessness drive, the push toward novelty seeking, all of that is ancient. It is shared with other primates. It predates our species. Whether a Homo habilis sitting still 2 million years ago experienced something they would have recognized as boredom in the way you feel it stuck in a waiting room, that is genuinely uncertain. But something functionally equivalent was almost certainly there. There is a controversial but fascinating theory about the transition to agriculture roughly 12,000 years ago that brings boredom right into the center of the story. The standard explanation is resource pressure. Growing populations needed more reliable food sources and started cultivating plants. That is probably a big part of it. But some researchers have pointed out that early agriculture was, by almost every measurable standard, harder and less nutritious than hunter-gathering. Early farmers worked more hours, had worse diets, and were more vulnerable to famine. So why do it? One possibility that keeps appearing in the literature: accumulated knowledge and idle experimentation. People who had spent generations noticing, tinkering, planting seeds for interest, watching what grew, the kind of extended low-stakes observation that only happens when basic needs are met and the mind needs something to do, eventually stumbled onto the insight that changed everything. Here is where all of this ancient history lands on something very present. The boredom that evolved in us over millions of years was a signal designed to push us toward meaningful engagement, making things, learning things, connecting with other people, exploring the world. It was productive discomfort. What we have done in the 21st century is build an entire industrial infrastructure specifically designed to eliminate that signal before it can do its job. The moment the boredom flare goes up, there is a phone in your hand, and the phone delivers an effortless fire hose of stimulation that satisfies just enough of the restlessness to make the signal go away, but does not actually fulfill any of the deeper things boredom was trying to push you toward. You do not make anything. You do not learn anything real. You do not genuinely connect. The hunger is quieted without being fed. There is a growing body of research, from psychologists like Sandy Mann and Aaron Westgate, who study boredom specifically, suggesting that allowing yourself to be genuinely bored without immediately reaching for a distraction is one of the most underrated things you can do for your mental life, not torturing yourself with it, not sitting in misery, but letting the discomfort arrive, staying with it for a few minutes, and watching what your brain does next. Because what it does next is almost always interesting. It starts problem solving. It drifts towards something you have been avoiding thinking about. It generates ideas. It connects things that were not obviously connected. The default mode network fires up and starts doing the exact work that evolution built it to do. Your ancient brain, given room to breathe, starts behaving like a caveman sitting by a fire with nothing to do. And that is not a bad thing at all. So did ancient humans get bored? Absolutely. Unquestionably, yes. The wandering mind, the restless urge to make something, the itch to tell a story or make a sound or try something new. These are not modern afflictions. They are ancient inheritance. Every time you find yourself staring out a window, zoning out in the middle of a task, feeling that vague, uncomfortable hunger for something you cannot quite name, that is the same signal that pushed a person sitting in a cave 40,000 years ago to pick up a piece of charcoal and draw a horse on the wall. The same signal that invented music, that invented language, that invented gods and stories, and eventually farms and cities and everything else. Boredom is not what you feel when nothing is happening. It is what happens right before something extraordinary begins. If this rewired something for you, follow a Preston Explains. There's a new one every day.